this is a settler colonial occupation. It amounts to the crime of aggression, and it cannot be defended on the ground of self-defense. An occupier, a colonizer doesn't have the right of self-defense.
Israel is consistently unfairly targeted in the UN system, including in the course of this commission of inquiry. Israel is the only country that's subject to a standing country-specific agenda.
The US shields Israel from renewed international scrutiny and criticism after several UN Special Rapporteurs highlight in their latest reports to the UN General Assembly the growing consensus over Israel's apartheid policies in the occupied Palestinian territory. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Israel's occupation is, quote, illegal and indistinguishable from settler colonialism. It has been, quote, willfully and carefully engineered to prevent the realization of the right of Palestinians to self-determination, and it constitutes, quote, an act of aggression. This was the stern conclusion by the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, who presented her first report to the UN General Assembly last week amid Israel's ongoing demolition of Palestinian homes in the occupied West Bank. Over 1,200 Palestinians have been forcibly evicted from their homes in Masefer Yatta by Israeli forces to make space for a live-fire training zone. Earlier this month, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem urged the International Criminal Court to act to prevent the expulsion of Palestinians, which it said would amount to a war crime and is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which bars the expulsion or forcible transfer of residents of occupied territory. Last week, several UN Special Rapporteurs, all independent experts, presented their reports to the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly in New York. The Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing found that Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes is, quote, nothing short of apartheid and amounts to the crime against humanity of persecution. The Special Rapporteur on racism found that Israel's practices and policies in the OPT, that is to say the occupied Palestinian territories, amounts to apartheid with extreme environmental and human rights consequences for Palestinians. And the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories criticized the UN for failing to hold Israel accountable for its continued violations of international law and for its, quote, apartheid practices. Francesca Albanese has held that position since May 2022. I spoke with her earlier today and started by asking her to explain her statement to the General Assembly that Israel is, quote, willfully pursuing the de-Palestinization of the occupied territory.
I make this claim in the context of the argument that Israel for 55 years has prevented the realization of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people in what remains of their ancestral homeland in the occupied Palestinian territory. And this right manifests as the right of the people to exist politically, economically, socially, and culturally. And Israel has been after each of these elements of the right of self-determination, preventing cultural manifestation of Palestinian identity, political will and political activism, even political activity. And there are many examples of how this translates into violations, but eventually what it sums up to, it's a de-Palestinianization of the occupied territory, like depriving it of its indigenous character in order to replace it with something else.
You also call Israel's actions, quote, proof of the intent to colonize the occupied territory through, quote, Israel's strategic fragmentation. Is the purpose of that policy to make an already elusive two-state solution even more impossible?
But I think this is what has happened in practice, because and the right of self-determination is extremely important in order to understand both the framework, the legal framework, and analyze the current reality. Because four things: Israel has prevented territorial sovereignty by fragmenting and annexing part of the occupied territory. Second, it has seized and used for Israeli colonies or Israeli businesses only natural resources belonging to the Palestinian people. It has prevented the formation, and it has interfered with the formation of Palestinian will, as I was saying. And it has also prevented the manifestation of Palestinian identity. This is crashing the existence of the Palestinian people as a whole. And what kind of state is being proposed if these very four manifestations of the right of self-determination are prevented?
You are just the last of many UN Special Rapporteurs who've accused Israel of the crime of apartheid. Former US President Jimmy Carter was one of the first people to use the word apartheid in connection with Israel in his book some 15 years ago called Peace, Not Apartheid. But does this mix up two issues? How the State of Israel handles its Arab nationals, who make up about 20% of the population, and how it behaves as an occupying power, because these two issues may be interlinked, but they're also quite separate, aren't they?
Yes, they are. But at the same time, the crime of apartheid looks at it is useful to understand and to qualify the current reality of widespread and systemic violations committed as part of a racial regime imposed over the Palestinian people with intent, with determination. So I've been often asked, why do I use the word apartheid without substantiating it in the report? Well, because it's substantiated elsewhere. My predecessor concluded its mandate with a report on why what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territory is apartheid. And there is a wall-to-wall consensus among human rights organizations in Israel and Palestine, on top of other international organizations, calling this apartheid. But for me, it's an illegal occupation that has translated, has morphed into apartheid because of a settler colonial intent, an intent to occupied, to displace the native population, replace it with its own population, its own nationals, and prevent the realization of any rights as the Palestinian people should be entitled to.
How do you respond, though, to those who've criticized you and who have criticized your predecessors as well, accusing you of bias, of anti-Semitism?
Of course, I do not agree, because, again, I based myself on facts that are fully documented and available to anyone. I encourage everyone to challenge me on the facts that I base myself and my reports on.
But so when the US says that you unfairly target Israel, what's your response to them? And have you tried to meet any US officials while you've been here?
First of all, my mandate comes from the Human Rights Council. So this mandate is conferred in order to document and report on the human rights violations that take place in the occupied Palestinian territory. So it's not my choice. I've been appointed to do that. So just to put things in context. And then, again, there is such an asymmetry of power and of resources and of responsibilities for the reality on the ground. It's not my intention to shelter the Palestinian de facto authorities from any criticism, but the reality is so disproportionate. What would it mean for me to go after the Palestinian Authority without addressing the broader context, first and foremost?
Because your mandate is not about Israel, it's about the behavior of the occupying power in Palestine, and for that matter, violations of human rights that may be committed by others. I
intend to look at the violations committed by everyone in the occupied Palestinian territory. And at the same time, I've said it elsewhere and in other occasions, if I didn't look at the broader context, at the situation in its complexity, I would miss the forest for the trees.
You've criticized the United Nations for failing to hold Israel accountable over the course of the last few decades, for emboldening the Israeli state in pursuing its current policies. You say that international law is, quote, only as valid as states' will to enforce it, which is clearly not the case when it comes to Israel. Can the UN, including the Secretary General of the United Nations, call for the end of the occupation of Ukraine and remain silent on Israel's occupation?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question, but for me, there is no point on international law to apply double standards. The situation in the occupied Palestinian territory has long passed the line of what is permitted by international law, has crossed that line, and it's unlawful. It's fully documented, it's unlawful. So the consequences are measures should be taken. There are political, diplomatic, and economic measures that should be taken before the impunity continues, because impunity breeds impunity. And the situation on the ground has reached a point of non-return. And I think I've said it over and over, and it should be taken seriously.
But how likely is that to happen? I mean, we know the reality of the United Nations and the Security Council and the members of the Security Council that continue to shield Israel. Can the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and there has been quite a bit of back and forth over the years, but Palestinians now have that recourse.
Yeah.
Can the ICC move the needle in a way that the Security Council of the UN will not?
I think it could and it should, because as I've said before, Palestine is more important to the ICC than the ICC to Palestine, in the sense that the legitimacy of the court and in its universal in its universality is at stake, because of course there are a lot of legitimate questions regarding why the prosecutor is not sending its investigators to the occupied Palestinian territory. So yes, I think it's important that a sign comes from the ICC, but at the same time, this shouldn't be used from individual states as an excuse not to take action, because individual states can also take their own measures to address the situations, and including in Europe. I mean, I often say that Europe should ban products that come from the colonies, not just label them, because by doing that, they put the burden on respecting international legality to the consumers.
Would you go as far as to say that European nations, in their silence, have also been accomplices of Israel's alleged crimes? And I'm thinking of European nations in general, but the role of the British, the historical role of the British government, which, when it left Palestine, left in place laws that the Israeli government, successive governments, have inherited and are implementing in violation of the human rights of Palestinians.
Yeah, I think that the term I'm more comfortable with is enablers. My predecessors has called a number of international stakeholders, including the European Union and the US, enablers, because of not addressing the patent human rights abuses and permitting Israel to go ahead with impunity.
So not accomplices, but enablers?
Enablers.
But aren't they more than enablers if they are funding, indirectly or directly, the military occupation that goes on?
And this is absolutely something I intend to look at during the course of my mandate.
You've called for a paradigm shift, even for a change in the terminology that we use, because many of us still use the word conflict when we talk about Israel-Palestine. You do not like to use this terminology.
I call for a paradigm shift, which includes first and foremost a change of language, a change of diagnostic. Again, there is nothing wrong with the use of the term conflict per se, but this has paralyzed sort of the approach. This is not a conflict that can be resolved through negotiation because of the imbalance of power and the power structure behind it. So we cannot expect the Palestinian to negotiate the conditions of their liberation. They should have the right of self-determination first, and then the rest can be negotiated, but this right is non-negotiable.
Francesca Albanese speaking with me earlier. Meanwhile, congressional Democrats have called on the Biden administration to keep Israel out of a visa waiver program that allows nationals of participating countries to travel to the United States for tourism or business for stays of 90 days or less without obtaining a visa. The letter signed last week by 20 lawmakers highlights the principle of reciprocity. It is the latest in a series of letters signed by Democrats in Congress pushing senior U.S. officials to prevent Israel's long-sought entry into the visa waiver program on the grounds of ethnic-based discrimination. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, a Palestinian American, was barred from entering Israel in 2019 and was forced to cancel a trip to the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Tlaib, who signed last week's letter, asked the Biden administration to address Israel's discriminatory entry policies for American citizens and to provide information on the number of Americans denied visas each year. Meanwhile, polls taken over the last few months have shown a shift in U.S. perceptions of Israel among Americans. According to a poll by the Pew Research Center, more than half of Americans, 55%, have favorable views of Israel, while 41% say they have unfavorable views of the country. Joining me now to discuss all this and more is Deborah Shushan, Director of Policy at J Street, a nonprofit advocacy group based in the United States and whose stated goal is a negotiated resolution between Israelis and Palestinians that meets the legitimate needs and aspirations of both peoples. Deborah Shushan, when J Street was established, I believe 15 years ago, it was to, quote, promote American leadership to end the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts peacefully and diplomatically. Today, there's a growing number of human rights organizations and human rights experts who reject this terminology of conflict, and they denounce Israel's quote-unquote apartheid policies. When you look at the global and U.S. climate surrounding Palestinian rights and U.S.-backed Israeli policies, how much of a shift, if any, do you see?
Thank you so much for the question, and thanks for having me, Ghida. I do see a shift that's happened. You're certainly correct that there is a growing body of human rights organizations, in particular, both Israeli and international, who have really been focusing on the situation on the ground. And I think that's very important. Whatever terminology is used to describe the occupation, I think the most important thing is really to spotlight. There's no question that there are very significant human rights violations that happen every day as a part of this 55-year and continuing occupation, as well as violations of international law. And so, yes, I think we do see shifts in that. And in terms of growing awareness of what is happening on the ground.
And this growing awareness, as you say, is reflected in recent polls, certainly in the last few years. They've shown that ordinary American voters, mostly Democrats, have become more sympathetic to the plight of Palestinians. Israel's advantage has narrowed, but it does remain significant and almost undeterred in the U.S. Congress. So yes, there are progressive Democrats who are trying to condition U.S. support for Israel, like keeping it out of the U.S. visa waiver program. But can enough progressive lawmakers unite behind a common position, like conditioning U.S. military aid to Israel, which has apparently the support of a majority of Democratic voters?
So this is a great question. And Ghida, there's no question that there is a difference that we see from polling. You mentioned Pew, and there are others, between where Democratic voters are on the issues regarding Israel-Palestine and where Congress is. And one of the things that J Street was really established for was showing American politicians, lawmakers, that they had more space, they have more space to be more progressive and active on the issues of Israel-Palestine than they might previously thought was possible. I do think that there's still clearly a lot of work to be done on this. J Street has championed the importance of oversight and transparency and restricting U.S. aid to Israel so that it would be used according to legitimate self-defense purposes as already required under U.S. law.
But is it doing enough, though? Is J Street and other progressive organizations, are they doing enough to support congressional candidates? The midterms are around the corner, who very clearly support Palestinian rights, because we saw the well-oiled, powerful machine that is AIPAC and the pro-Israel lobby in this country, investing quite heavily in trying to defeat any prospective members of Congress who sympathize with Palestinians and are vocally critical of Israel.
There is no question, Ghida, that the obstacles that we are up against are formidable. When you have organizations like AIPAC, which you mentioned, which seem to have, bottomless coffers and Republican mega donors that they can call upon to donate millions of dollars, which they then use in Democratic primaries to try to defeat progressive candidates. We are certainly doing grassroots important work in order to rally the majority of Jewish Americans who believe in the importance of diplomacy, who are pro-Israel, but believe that the occupation must end.
But hold on this note, though, are you doing enough to let American voters, some of your own members, let them know that since 2016, the US has committed itself to providing Israel with $38 billion over a period of 10 years. That's $3.8 billion every year with no strings attached. The US is essentially bankrolling Israel's illegal military occupation, isn't it? How much of an accomplice has it been? And to what extent are US taxpayers realizing this, that their money is helping fund and sustain an illegal occupation?
J Street does support US aid to Israel for Israel's legitimate self-defense purposes, which is what would be allowed for the US to give any country under US law. And we think that's very important. We strongly support Israel and its security. At the same time, we have done quite a bit to indicate what the occupation looks like, to make sure that our supporters and others are aware of that, and to insist on the importance of transparency, accountability, and restrictions on how US aid can be used, actually enforcing those restrictions.
Sure, but how much of a priority does this issue remain, even for groups like yours? Because as the prospects of a two-state solution fade, there are now other issues that you and other groups focus your attention on, including protecting freedoms and democracy at home. So how much of an issue does the Israel-Palestine situation remain for you?
I'm so glad that you asked the question, Ghida, and that you also phrased it in that way. Because one of the things that J Street has really been focusing on in the last couple of years, as we and others have really come to understand the danger that American democracy is under at this moment, is to really connect the dots, right? We realize that there are threats to democracy around the world, not only in the United States, in Israel, in Brazil, in the Philippines. You can go on and on and on, in Hungary, et cetera, et cetera. And we think it's extremely important to connect the dots. And so for us, as we continue to fight for a diplomatic solution and for a US approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that can bring about a diplomatic solution, we focus also on the issue of democracy in Israel, which is connected ultimately, again, in terms of this global struggle, to fighting for democracy here at home, which has also been a major focus for us as well.
All right, Deborah Shushan, Director of Policy at J Street. Great pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ghida.
At a time when the Western world is mobilizing to denounce the occupation of parts of Ukraine and appears to be rediscovering the UN Charter and international law, its stance towards the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains bizarre. Calling it a conflict is not only hypocritical, but it blurs reality. A reality that is otherwise clear. Israel is occupying the state of Palestine in its 1967 borders as codified under international law. There is no conflict between Israel and Palestine, just like there can be no conflict between a violent aggressor or rapist and their victim. There is the naked occupation by the State of Israel of the State of Palestine, which, according to Special Rapporteur Albanese, amounts to a crime of aggression. Meanwhile, the Security Council has shown its limitations, as it does every time one of its permanent members becomes the guardian angel of, as a case in point, Israel. To ask both parties to settle their differences over the negotiating table is another glaring hypocritical manipulation. It hasn't worked, simply because it cannot work, as long as Israel can count on the blind, unwavering support of Washington and other capitals for the growing colonization and subjugation of Palestine. And so, in short, while it's all well and good to debate whether Israel's policies towards Palestinians amount to crimes of apartheid or not, or whether Palestinians are victims of human rights abuses, even if the evidence is glaring, what is not debatable is that the State of Palestine, an observer state seated at the UN General Assembly, has been occupied by Israel for more than 5 decades, with the complicity of powerful countries and ultimately the United Nations itself. If the recent occupation of Ukraine is to end, so must the long occupation of Palestine, if international law means anything. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.